So Parthia, one of Rome's greatest enemies, the earliest, I guess, historically, canonically, from all the videos we've seen on this channel, the earliest that Parthia appears is like when it breaks free from the Seleucid Empire. I believe that's the earliest we see we hear of Parthia, at least in terms of like historical canon, and chronologically. So chronologically, it's super late right now. I don't even know why I'm recording, but yeah. So we're gonna be looking about a little bit more about Parthia. What exactly makes them such a great enemy of Rome? I disagree with it being Rome's greatest enemy. I believe that title belongs to Hannibal Barca, but that's just my opinion. So yeah, we're gonna be really cool seeing and learning about one of Rome's greatest enemies, Parthia. So without any further ado, from the great kings and generals, tell me about the rise and fall of Parthia, Rome's greatest enemy.
The Parthian Empire is one of the most famous and least understood empires in world history, rising from humble beginnings to earn titles such as Destroyers of the Seleucids, Conquerors of Gandhara, and Rome's greatest enemy. Beyond their obvious martial skill, the Parthians were also shrewd diplomats and expert administrators, forging a unique empire that combined their nomadic roots with the Hellenism of their Seleucid forebears and the traditions of Persia herself to create one of the ancient world's most vibrantly unique states. Who were the Parthians? Where did they come from? And how did they set about building their massive empire? Welcome to our video on the Parthian Empire, its history, its military, and its many cultural and political achievements as a crossroads of Eurasia and the Silk Road. Parthians are an elusive empire to study, particularly due to the lack of sources from the people of Parthia themselves. The Romans wrote plenty about the Parthians, but being their traditional archenemies, they often paint the Parthians in a negative light. So while we can claim some information from Roman writers, they should always be taken with a grain of salt. Additionally, some Chinese sources also mention Parthia, and the Chinese emissary Gan Ying is said to have gone to Parthia on his way to find Rome. Beyond the written word, archaeology also helps us piece together Parthian society. In the land once ruled by the Parthians, archaeological sites such as Nisa in Turkmenistan have a significant Parthian presence. Moreover, an extensive corpus of coins allows us to establish a dynastic cohesion of Parthian kings. These coins often have Greek inscriptions on them, implying that the Parthians maintained continuity with the post-Alexander Hellenistic rulers who controlled Persia before them. Before we get into how the Parthians ended up conquering the Middle East, let us first take a broader look at the ancient world before their rise to power. After the death of
Excuse me. But yeah, it's interesting to hear that there's not much about Parthia, considering we've heard about Parthia so much in this channel, you know, with all the Rome videos we've done and whatnot. And it's interesting they didn't leave much for themselves to write about. So I find that interesting for such an important empire to have like nothing from them is a little, I don't know, just interesting, I suppose. And yeah, I was correct that the first time in terms of chronology, in the historical timeline, yeah, they first appear from the Seleucid Empire and then go on to devour most of that and then kind of replace it as the next great thing. And it kind of makes a lot of sense that they would you know, kind of keep in continuity with the Hellenistic world, because I guess that's where they kind of spawned from one of the most powerful and influential of the Hellenistic successor kingdoms, the Seleucids. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Alexander the Great, most of what had once been the Persian Achaemenid Empire was taken over by one of his generals, Seleucus I Nicator. The Seleucids had a unique approach to ruling the Achaemenid core, managing their empire in conjunction with the noble families of the former Achaemenid Empire in a sort of large web of social networks. As a result, the empire was more decentralized than other Hellenistic states, which lent itself to a more flexible cultural policy. Hence, while the Seleucids promoted aspects of Hellenistic Greek culture, such as the worship of Apollo, Persian culture remained strong, albeit coexisting with a panoply of other cultures in the Seleucid domain. In the west, the Seleucids ruled parts of modern-day Iraq and Armenia, where a diverse array of peoples, such as Jews, Babylonians, Armenians, and Greeks, lived. These regions were more or less the most stable of the empire. However, they were also battlegrounds in wars with powerful states like the Attalids, Ptolemies, Romans, Armenians, and Pontics. In the east, the empire lost its provinces to the Maurya Empire early on in the late 300s BCE. This region was also fairly diverse and would come to play an important role in Parthia's formation.
Yeah, after looking at the Diadochi Wars, like originally, I would say that Ptolemy and probably Ptolemaic Egypt was my favorite, but after really digging into like the successor kingdoms and we watched that series, I actually have kind of changed my opinion. I actually would consider the Seleucid Empire my favorite successor kingdom, and even the first Seleucus, probably my favorite of the Diadochi due to how far he got. And yeah, I just think like the Seleucid Empire has actually kind of been my obsession for a bit. I really want to learn more about this empire, and I think like the cultural aspect is what most is interesting to me, because obviously the first Seleucus was notable for being the only one of Alexander's men to, I guess, remain faithful to their Persian wives, and like obviously the promoting of Greek culture, but also keeping with this, allowing the Persian cultures to remain. It's like a weird cultural blend of civilization, and it's like probably what Alexander was trying to accomplish and envision before he died, like this weird coexisting culture and theological ideas, I think. So I don't know, I think I do really want to learn more about the Seleucid Empire, because I just find them interesting in terms of just the multicultural aspect of it,
Finally, in the north of modern-day Central Asia lies a vast steppeland that was important for trade throughout human history, and during this time was populated by nomadic, predominantly Iranian-speaking peoples. These peoples were often considered barbaric by both Greeks and Persians, due to such habits as having women archers on horseback. Their Zoroastrian religion was far different from the one of the Achaemenids, as they worshipped many deities rather than one. It is from these northern steppelands that the Parthians would arise. The story of the Parthian Empire begins around 247 BCE, in the land of Chorasmia. During this time, the Hellenic Kingdom of Bactria had declared independence from Seleucid Persia, causing a struggle between the Seleucids and what they saw as a breakaway province. Meanwhile, in the lands between the Aral and Caspian Seas, a Scythian-adjacent people called the Pani were organizing under new leadership, with two brothers called Ashk or Arsakes and Tidad or Tiridates, managing to unite the many tribes of Parthia under their rule. Newly unified, the Parthians instigated revolts in the north and managed to take the regions of Hyrcania and Chorasmia from the Seleucids. Seleucus II was fighting a war with the Ptolemies at the time, and was unable to fight back effectively. Thus, the Parthians solidified their conquests, establishing the first capital, Ashgabat, which was located somewhere around modern-day Turkmenistan.
Do you want to know where to invest $1,000?
The Seleucids pushed back against the rising Parthian tide in 209 BCE, when Antiochus III defeated the Parthians in battle, making them his vassals. However, this fealty would not last for long, as the Parthians soon broke free and started growing once more. The small Parthian state saw its first large expansion under Merbat I, or Mithridates I, the first royal to assume the old Achaemenid title of King of Kings on his coinage. Between 160 to 140 BCE, he initiated a lightning campaign against the Seleucid Empire, which resulted in massive conquests in Media, Babylon, and Seleucia on the Tigris. These newly annexed territories would later become core territories of the Parthian Empire. But at the onset, Parthian control of these lands was tenuous. The locals in these cosmopolitan, city-dense regions had a very urban-centric view of nomadic peoples, considering them to be underdeveloped baboons. The Seleucids made a final attempt to regain their lost territories when Phraates, or Farhad II, ruled over Parthia, and initially saw significant success in this endeavour, as the locals saw them as liberators, delivering them from the yoke of Parthian barbarism. However, the reconquering Greeks enraged the people of the reoccupied territories with their outrageous economic demands. Thus, they revolted, allowing the Parthians to counterattack in 129 BCE and drive the Seleucids back to Syria. This ended all hope for a Seleucid reconquest of their Asian heartland, and they would remain a diminished rump state until they were finally annexed by Pompey and the Romans in 63 BCE. Although having replaced the Seleucids as the masters of Persia, the Parthians adopted a lot from their Seleucid forebears, emulating their ruler cults and uses of Achaemenid royal vocabulary to ensure their rule was adapted to local circumstances. Once the Seleucids were defeated, the Parthians pivoted east, for they were under nomadic assault. The Scythians, nomadic Iranian cousins to the Parthians, were rampaging west from their homeland in what is now eastern Turkestan. Parthian king Phraates and his successors tried to stop them, but failed miserably. Meanwhile, rebellions had broken out in the western provinces, including in the Arab kingdom of Caracini. Overall, the Parthians were learning that conquering land was one thing, but defending and holding it was another.
Yeah, isn't that a famous saying? It's easy to conquer, but it's harder to rule. I said it correctly, but you've heard quotes like that in the same vein. I've heard it in like novels and, you know, many different series. And yeah, watching the Seleucids just get eaten away by their own provinces breaking free is, yeah, insane. But that's kind of the thing with its territory, right? So yeah, still not probably the biggest, but also a lot of room for it to be unstable due to all that territory and different cultures and whatnot. Easily how things could fall apart, you know? And, yeah, it seems to me like, yeah, the Parthians excel on horseback. I mean, when we covered, like, the Julius Caesar series by Historia Civilis, a lot of horsemanship and archery. So that seems to be a really big, and useful fighting style. I mean, heck, even like the Mongols, I think, relied a lot on that, and look at how great they became. So, you know, that's archery and horseback, kind of OP. I play this video game called Mount and Blade Warband, and I often play as a horse archer because I'm able to solo large number of enemies. So I think even video games would agree that, you know, horse archery is kind of OP.
However, around 123 BC, King Mithridates II ascended to the Parthian throne and began righting the ship of state. After solidifying the Parthian grip in the west, he turned to the eastern provinces to deal with the nomadic incursions, where he pushed the Scythians back to the far side of the river Oxus and turned their newly founded kingdom of Sakistan into a vassal state. Mithridates was the first Parthian to rule as a neighbour to the Romans, who reached the Euphrates at around this time. During this period, the kingdom of Armenia also bordered Parthia and was engaging in many conquests across the region. Mithridates initially tried to woo the Romans into an alliance against Armenia, but the infamous Sulla contemptuously rejected them. Mithridates, who felt slighted, instead joined forces with Armenia and Asia Minor against the Romans, initiating a vendetta that would last centuries. After the death of the able and powerful Mithridates II in 88,
so that's how it begins. Learning about the earliest contact of Rome and Parthia, who would go on to be rivals for a long time. And I do know about Armenia. Obviously, Mark Antony had to deal with Armenia when he wanted to go into Parthia for his great invasion. So I do remember that. And, yeah, the Parthians were really good, I think, at least making sure the Romans didn't conquer most of it, you know. Then again, I also remember looking at videos of Rome trying to take Arabia and that failing, so they couldn't go really deep in the Middle East, like around here, I think. But they did make an establishment here, so yeah, it's interesting, you know. I always kind of wonder what Julius Caesar would have done, because I think Julius Caesar was planning on going to Parthia. I like wonder what his end goal would have been, how far he would have went, what he would have done. I know he had general plans that he would eventually come back to Rome. I think it would have been cool to see that. I don't know, that's like one of the, you know, great what ifs in my mind.
BC, the empire was rather stagnant. Armenia, meanwhile, was conquering as far south as Ecbatana, causing the Seleucid rump state to invite the Armenian king to occupy the throne of Syria and claim himself to be the king of kings, in direct contradiction to Parthian royal ideology. The Romans, alarmed by the expansion of Armenia in Asia Minor, offered a treaty to Parthian king Phraates III, who took it, resulting in a rare example of Roman-Parthian cooperation.
Wow. That's interesting. I did not know about this cool team up between them. We've only heard about them being rivals, but them working together to curb Armenia. Yeah, the Romans, while being pretty big expansionists themselves, were against everyone else expanding too much. You know, like it reminds me when the Seleucids were on the verge of conquering Ptolemaic Egypt, and then the Romans sent an ambassador to, I believe it was Antiochus IV. Could be wrong about that. And then basically told him to knock it off. So yeah, the Romans were like, we can expand, but we're gonna make sure you don't. You know? Wow, I did not know about this. Wow. When enemies become allies.
As they worked to contain Armenia. However, this did not change the Roman perception of the Parthians as a lesser entity, something they would regret later. Before we continue on to the epic wars with Rome, we must first understand how the Parthian military worked. The Parthians built their military using their old nomadic traditions, while adapting it to also function in wars with sedentary empires, such as the Seleucids, Armenians, and Romans. In general, the Parthian army was de-standardized. Parthian rulers usually let local kings rule various regions of the empire in their stead, and so had to call upon these royal vassals to amass local troops based on demand. The core of the Parthian army, called Spad, had a corps of cavalry and archers, usually Iranians, who were trained in such arts from their infancy. Due to their nomadic roots, Parthians generally favored cavalry warfare, because it allowed for flexibility and speed in engagements. Using arrows, the Parthians would work in Simpsons-style hit-and-run tactics which would confuse the enemy and provide lightning bolt strikes that left their enemies weakened and demoralized. Wars with Rome began after the fall of Tigranes the Great of Armenia.
So that's interesting learning about the Parthian military system. I do think, yeah, cavalry is very OP, especially when well utilized. And yeah, as we know, the Parthians seem to have excelled a lot in horsemanship, which makes sense. Like speed, maneuverability, like cavalry is really OP when well utilized, you know? So that's interesting about the decentralized army and having to basically call upon it.
Parthians, who had on occasion cooperated with the Romans, had installed members of the Parthian Arsacid dynasty in various Caucasus states. In addition, after Pompey's invasion of Armenia, initially fruitful negotiations fell apart after disputes arose over the fertile crossroads of Mesopotamia. As a result, a few years later, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Scrooge McDuck of ancient Rome,
Yeah, I could never forget Crassus and his invasion of Parthia. I always think of like the Historia Civilis telling, where he comes here, his son gets killed, the Parthians spam horse archery. They just have a crapload of archers and like a bunch of camels bringing them infinite ammo arrows. And so they just basically wear down the Romans. And then they like the weird episode where they invite Crassus out for negotiations. Then they make him get on a horse, and then he face plants off the horse, and then they just kill him. And then they have that one dude dress up as Crassus and like have their own mock Roman triumph. Like the Parthians were wild. Like if Historia Civilis' telling was that accurate, then I'm like, the Parthians had like a sick sense of humor. Giant trolls, you know? That I'm sorry, I know Crassus did a lot, like with the Spartacus revolt and being rich and one of the triumvirate members, but all I can think about is really undignified end and his failure of an invasion. Unfortunately, that kind of overshadows his utter accomplishment, at least in my eyes, you know?
And great sponsor of the first triumvirate YouTube channel initiated a campaign against the Parthians, which ended disastrously. In the infamous Battle of Carrhae, Parthian troops faced the Roman legions and managed to brutally defeat them. Crassus was captured and was executed either via decapitation and becoming a theatre prop, or by being made to swallow molten gold. Crassus was not the only Roman military leader the Parthians humiliated, as they also ambushed Pacorus in 51 BCE, fought off Cicero when he was governor of Cilicia, and went toe-to-toe against both Mark Antony and his arch-rival Augustus on separate occasions. The end result of all this was that the Parthians succeeded in taking over parts of the Caucasus and Mesopotamia, and installing vassals in their place.
Again, they're fighting off of so many military leaders, especially in that era from Caesar all the way to the birth of the Empire Octavian, is really amazing when you think about how they were able to fight off Rome expanding too deep into their territory and humiliate some pretty important figures in Roman history. You know, like, it really is just impressive, the Parthians. And they were going up against a powerful peak Rome, so that makes them even more impressive, the victories they gain, you know?
Over the 1st century CE, many wars between Rome and Parthia were fought in Mesopotamia, inflicting horrors upon the locals and resulting in some territorial changes. It was here that some of the instability of the Parthian mode of government unfolded. Many Parthian emperors would often assume power through palace coups against their sons or brothers. The Romans would, on occasion, use this to their advantage to secure some sort of peace. Moreover, the Romans were also capable of fomenting rebellions in Parthia's decentralized provinces, which, as previously mentioned, exercised considerable self-rule. One of these rebellions, led by a man named Gondophares, took place in the eastern end of the empire. Declaring independence, Gondophares established his own dynasty, the so-called Indo-Parthian kingdom, with himself as yet another king of kings. He then proceeded to fight the Indo-Scythians and Indo-Greeks in the east, and take control of parts of Gantara and Bactria, becoming one of the myriad peoples who inhabited this rich land. It was only in the 2nd century CE that the Romans began to make incursions inside Parthia. Trajan, who was a maximalist in terms of extending Roman influence
Holy crap, Trajan. We all know about the great Emperor Trajan, man.
over the Euphrates River, initiated an invasion of Parthia in 115 CE. The campaign resulted in the maximum ever extent of the Roman Empire, as well as the fall of Ctesiphon, Parthia's capital. This was an unstable victory, however, and the Parthians quickly regained many of these territories. Hadrian, Trajan's successor, was a geopolitical realist, preferring to maintain the Euphrates as a border. Under Parthian king Vologases III, the Parthians continued to regain ground, but the Romans turned the tide against them, and in AD 165 once again entered Ctesiphon. Some western Iranian provinces were thus ceded to Rome, and the unstable Parthian government was unable to make further gains. This was what enabled Emperor Septimus Severus to attack and capture Ctesiphon again in AD 197. This time the Parthians were firmly in decline, and they would soon lose control over their western vassals, like Armenia, to Roman control. Some of these fortunes were reversed in AD 217, when Artabanus V defeated the Romans in battle. This was, however, too little too late for the once mighty empire. Fratricidal strife with his brother Vologases V led to chaos in the empire, one that a small dynasty led by a man named Ardashir would soon exploit. Having now provided an abridged version...
Yeah, the Sassanids, right? Like, they're the ones who rise up to take the place of Parthia, so... Yeah, I think that was a cool little foreshadowing there. And yeah, I guess just the thing about Parthia is just like the instability, as he's mentioned several times, like the governmental thing. It's not one consolidated like gain. It's kind of like there's like these vassals kind of ruling on their own, you know? So like it's interesting he keeps bringing that, and obviously the instability between how everyone's trying to rule by between murdering each other, so it makes sense that all that internal strife would eventually just come collapsing down on them, you know?
Of Parthian history, let us now look at the empire's culture and society. As previously stated, Parthia was an amalgamation of the nomadic culture of its rulers, the Achaemenid and Hellenistic culture of its forebears, as well as the myriads of local cultures of its subjects and vassals. Parthia was more decentralized than its predecessors or successors, with much more focus being put on local vassal kings than satraps appointed by the central government. Parthian society was not without its innovations. In particular, the Romans greatly admired Parthian irrigation techniques and deliberately emulated them. This also suggests that, although generally taking a hands-off approach to their vassals, the Parthians still had an active hand in guiding their agricultural and economic output. Trade with China was also important, as the Parthians acted as a sort of mediating force between the Middle Kingdom and Eternal Rome. The Parthians maintained this fluidity in the realm of religion as well. Unlike their Sasanian successors, who preferred to unify the doctrines of Zoroastrianism, the Parthians appear to have allowed for much more regional diversity in the Iranian religion.
Yeah, that seems to be the thing I'm catching on as well. Not decentralized, letting kind of everyone go with the flow, everyone kind of sort of be their own thing. Even in, not just in terms of military and rulership, kind of like a little hands-off, a little, you know? And, and being more diverse and willing and open to other people. So it kind of makes sense with them being sort of nomadic, kind of hands-off, go with the flow in a sense. You know, at least compared to other areas and empires and whatnot. So I will say that that's interesting, and it kind of like makes sense. Yeah, the Parthians would be like that to me.
This is seen in coinage, where Greek deities merge with Iranian ones, such as Zeus Oromasdes and Athena Artemis Anahita. The use of Greek probably was appealing to many Parthian vassals, who preferred it over the Parthian language, which they saw as barbaric. Both the Iranian and Greek pantheons seem to have been worshipped across the empire, and local religions, such as that of the Jews, Babylonians, Armenian pagans, and even Proto-Christians, Buddhists and Gnostics, had some place in the laissez-faire empire. With that said, the Parthians placed a great deal of focus on Ahura Mazda, the high god, as well as Anahita, the fertility goddess, and Mithras, the sun god, a well-known triumvirate of deities in Iranian polytheism. In Ctesiphon, government was arranged based on two councils, one of the great nobles and one of the elders and magi who advised the king. This was an intriguing deviation from Achaemenid norms, but it is unclear what the exact functions of these two councils were. While much has been said of the Parthians' love of Greek culture in coinage, for which many 20th century Iranian nationalists chastised them, the Parthians were an adaptable and diverse people. Some Neo-Iranian cultural revivals actually began under rulers such as Vologases I in the 1st century AD, who put on his coins a quintessentially Persian fire altar with a sacrificing priest. The Parthians did also appear to have continued the norm of using ruler cults, something which many Iranian dynasties did. Parthian art and architecture was also very diverse and syncretic, with archaeology in the western provinces revealing buildings that are influenced by Achaemenid, Hellenistic, and Mesopotamian forms. Some of the most important features of art from the later Sasanian and Islamic periods, such as the Avan and stucco decoration, have their origin in the Parthian period. We can thus see that Parthian culture was a product of its Hellenistic and Iranian origins, with remarkable flexibility and syncretism. The Parthian Empire, like many of its vassals, was
I think the word flexibility is probably the best way I can describe the Parthians. Not only in their fighting with horsemanship, but in their rule, in their... like everything. I feel like flexibility is the operative word that I would also use in describing the Parthians, which make them very interesting. They're also kind of their own amalgamation and mix of, like, culture, you know?
Decline by the 3rd century CE, torn up in a civil war between dynastic claimants Artabanus and Vologeses, while a new regional ruler from Ardashir Kawara in the south of Persia, called Ardashir I, rose to prominence via conquest. In 224 CE, he managed to conquer the city of Ctesiphon and crowned himself King of Kings. This heralded the end of the Parthian Empire, and the beginning of the Sasanian Empire was much more centralized and Irano-centric than Parthia, and followed a very different path in terms of governance. However, as we have seen, some of Parthia's innovations survived in culture and architecture. Legends even claim that Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, who was born on the border between Iran and Iraq, claimed descent from Parthian kings. The Parthians today are usually remembered as an enemy of Rome, and by some as a bizarre Hellenizing outlier in Iranian national history. However, Parthia produced a great deal of artistic, cultural, and economic innovations, refusing to stick to one type of governance. Using Hellenistic, Iranian, nomadic, and many local types of cultural and political organizations, the Parthians produced a tumultuous yet innovative empire in between the Silk Roads. Parthia stands out as a nexus point which transformed Iran and its surrounding regions, and its achievements are still with us to this day. Thanks again to War Thunder.
So yeah, another really cool and interesting video from the Great Kings and Generals, and it's cool to have some more knowledge on Parthia.